And Sarah, obviously a number of panellists have focused on where they've seen sort of priorities being taken forwards at COP29 and what might come for the future. What do you see as some of the key sort of priorities that were delivered at COP29 for yourself, taking that sort of broader overview from a policy perspective?
I think the first thing to say is to ground truth this agreement slightly, is to say that there are two numbers. There's the 1.3 trillion, which is the ambition or the goal, and then there's the 200 billion, which the developed countries have promised. And although there was an agreement, the majority or many people in the room were not happy with the lower figure being the promised figure. So the Africa delegation, for example, called it unacceptable. And I think this reflects maybe a 15-year pattern of two different paradigms clashing and it manifesting at this COP. So, for example, we're talking about different types of money. So, and I don't think that we're talking about the same thing. So climate finance for me, or traditionally, has always been a concessional, grant-based, cheaper form of liquidity for developing countries to mitigate and adapt to a historic crisis that they didn't cause. And that climate justice narrative was in half of the room, and then the other half of the room was the developed countries who are trying to push back on historical responsibility and remove text that refers to differentiated responsibilities and put instead forward-looking from all sources, innovative sources, and sort of dilute that sense. So there is still conflict at COPs around those two figures, and I think that is what is going to go forward. So there's a conundrum, in fact. We're not talking about finance in the abstract, but finance that's owned and used by different groups. We're talking about finance that's coming from the public sector, which is still incredibly low, even considering the promises that have been made, for the last 15 years. And then we're talking about private finance, which for many people is only loosely, you could only loosely categorize it as climate related. Much of it is private investment. And I think the loss of credibility or the loss of trust between the Annex 1 and 2 countries is that many developing countries believe that some of what is being counted is purely private market flows. And that in this stretching of the commitment to the 1.3, the developed countries are just counting stuff that is not technically climate finance. So these conflicts are very, very deep-rooted. So with respect, I think the presidency of the COP did a brilliant job in keeping it together. But I think that those tensions are going to move forward. And another tension that's going to move forward is who is actually going to pay, because it's easy when people are discussing a goal and the collective, the new collective quantified goal is something that's going to happen by 2035, to forget what's actually happening today. And the commitments of climate finance over 2024, including at Baku, only make 228 million. Tiny. It's a 5-year low for climate finance. So when everybody is looking over here at this fantastic new target, what's actually happening is a very, very low commitment from the Annex 1 countries. However, to end on a slightly more positive note, I think if you look at it comparatively, when people talk about 1.3 trillion, they're talking about the cost of replacing stuff, decommissioning things, building infrastructure from scratch, from new. That's where the 1.3 trillion comes from. But if we look at it comparatively as a marginal cost of switching finance, which is already there, the 1.3 trillion figure suddenly looks very small and doable. So, for example, it's only 1% of global GDP. It's less than 1/100th of global fixed income markets in 2023. It's equivalent to 3,000ths of the assets of global finance institutions in 2022. That's 0.003% of money currently managed by asset managers. That's all that we need to actually shift to make the 1.3 figure. So I think the challenge here is, how is the private sector going to be nudged to step up to that figure, given that the developed countries have obviously fallen away from any sense of their historical responsibility. And I say that sadly because I believe in climate justice. But let's face it, this pantomime has got to stop, really, where one group come and pretend that they're still going to do that, and the other group come asking for money and never get it. You know, that sort of performance is a waste of everybody's time. So I would rather concentrate on the types of regulation from governments that can shift that money that's already there, rather than think of it as a new sum. So thank you.
Thank you. I think it reflects obviously on the changing nature of COPs as well as the negotiated text gets completed. What do we want to see out of delivery and implementation, and then how that will be most effective for the future? And then maybe I could come back to you just yourselves with obviously the COP presidency in